Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. A woman of noble character, who can find? That's probably the most famous line from the chapter in the Bible that is the topic of today's video, Proverbs 31. You can find all kinds of Bible studies and resources about Proverbs 31, mostly or probably exclusively targeted toward women. The ideal of a Proverbs 31 woman is treated as something of an aspiration, and there is a lot to live up to. This is quite an amazing woman, as we'll see. Maybe even too amazing. But because the Old Testament is dominated by male characters, when we have such an incredibly positive description of a woman, this passage has become the focus of a lot of popular interest among Christian women. There's even a sizable ministry called Proverbs 31 Ministry that's targeted at serving women. But what is a Proverbs 31 woman, and does she exist? Is Bigfoot real, and if so, where did it go after it left Noah's Ark? Today we're going to address the easier of these questions, the Proverbs 31 woman. Now, for some, this chapter and its popular understanding have been a great encouragement, and if that's you, that is awesome. But for others, this passage and the culture around it has perhaps been deeply wounding. Could there be some redeeming quality to this chapter when we look at its original context? Well, we certainly hope so. To get us started, Philip is going to mansplain what the real context of this passage is all about. Take it away, Philip.
Thanks, Kyle. Now, for those of you who don't know what mansplaining is, you know what? Never mind, not important. Proverbs 31 is found in the book of Proverbs.
Yeah, this is going great.
And the book of Proverbs is an anthology of wisdom literature collections. And wisdom literature is a genre we find frequently in the Bible. It includes the books of Proverbs, Song of Songs, Job, Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet, certain Psalms. If you're feeling really spicy, you can throw in James into that too. Scholars have identified similar literature in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. The literature from Israel's neighbors can be more generally classified as sapiential literature because it doesn't conform precisely to the wisdom literature genre as we see it in the Bible. That is to say, biblical wisdom literature is a more narrowly defined kind of sapiential literature that has parallels in other cultures, which includes other kinds of sapiential texts beyond wisdom literature, things like medico-magical texts, exorcism texts, and onomastica or encyclopedias. We don't see those kinds of literature in the Bible, so wisdom literature has become more narrowly defined to mean the genre we do see in the Bible. But what is interesting, beyond specific parallels like the instruction of Amenemope in Proverbs 22, is the social context from which these sapiential literature is derived. These texts are all about instruction. They're teaching tools. Some texts, particularly the Egyptian ones, make this very explicit. A common formulaic pattern we see in Egyptian texts is the instruction of the author made for his son or a student. It is explicitly made for a student or a son by a teacher or a father. So the context for this instruction seems to be either at home or, much more likely, primarily at schools, as in scribal or priestly schools, or even court schools. This is the most common context we see for sapiential literature. It is for young men, especially royal or noble ones, and it's meant to provide them with the wisdom and training needed to serve at court. So while this may have been useful at home, it was probably only used in certain kinds of homes, like those of the wealthy. And if it was used in homes as instructional material, we may consider that as an additional locus of use and not the primary one. These sapiential works were composed and preserved as pieces of literature, and that likely occurred at organized schools, to which we have many references in Near Eastern cultures. Scholars like Roland de Vaux and Medinger have long suggested royal institutions and officials in the early Israelite court followed a template from the Egyptian court, which would have included these kinds of schools, which prepared the young men from leading families to serve at court. This is another trend we see with various kinds of sapiential literature, including Proverbs, and it was linked with the court and royalty. Egyptian wisdom literature often has at its heart concerns related to ma'at, the Egyptian principle of right order, justice, and divine harmony. It was the pharaoh's responsibility to uphold ma'at and restore it if it was lost. We see a similar concern in Israelite literature. The king's responsibility is to uphold justice and righteousness, a roughly analogous idea to Egypt's ma'at. Principles like honesty, self-control, duty, and diligence prepare the nobility to assist in these royal goals. The book of Proverbs, more so than the other Israelite wisdom traditions, is linked with the royal court, if not with royalty itself. With that in mind, what more can we know about Proverbs as court literature, and how does this impact the way we read Proverbs 31?
Now, to understand Proverbs 31, we first need to understand its role in the book as a whole. Now, again, this book is linked with the Israelite courtly tradition, and most likely with the instruction of young men from noble families. The book of Proverbs is an anthology. It's not a single cohesive composition, but an aggregation of several distinct sections. Michael Fox, a scholar who does excellent work on Israelite wisdom literature, identifies 6 distinct parts to Proverbs. The first is a kind of extended prologue that includes chapters 1 through 9. Like all good introductions, this was probably written as the last part of the book. It includes a series of 10 lectures with interludes. These first lectures are formulaic in that they include an address from the father to the son, asking the son to listen to the instruction, and then giving a lesson and a conclusion. These lectures are all addressed to a young man, and they seem to pertain to pitfalls and temptations that are particularly relevant to a young man growing into adulthood. The promiscuous woman is a common feature of these lectures, as we'll see in chapters 5, 6, and 7. In the interludes, we see general praises of wisdom itself, which is consistently personified as a woman, referred to as Lady Wisdom. We see that Lady Wisdom is available to all who seek her. She is the firstborn of creation, and on and on. We have a video on this theme and how she's related to the Egyptian idea of Ma'at that you can check out here. Lady Wisdom has a foil in Lady Folly, who is a kind of abstraction of the promiscuous woman we see in the lectures. Lady Folly is the opposite of Lady Wisdom. The rest of the book includes collections of sayings, the actual Proverbs, the sayings that you probably associate with this book. Each collection is introduced with a heading. The first one is attributed to Solomon and runs from chapter 10 to chapter 22. Chapters 22 through 24 is the next section with 30 sayings of the wise, which seem to be copied from Egyptian wisdom literature. Chapter 24 also includes other wise sayings. Chapters 25 through 29 are attributed to Solomon, but said to have been collected during the reign of Hezekiah. The final chapters are what Michael Fox calls appendices. These include the sayings of Agur, some various aphorisms, the teachings of Lemuel's mother, and finally the chapter we're concerned with, the Woman of Strength.
In evaluating this chapter, we're going to focus on the virtues of the so-called Woman of Strength or Woman of Valor. So what does the woman do in this chapter? We see she's involved in domestic industry. She provides for the family. She's also industrious, active, and engages in commercial activities outside of the home. She makes financial decisions and purchases property. She's engaged in charity work. She brings honor and good things to her husband. Quite the woman. But how should we understand exactly what this woman is like? I'm glad you asked, because there are a lot of possible ways to interpret it. But before we get there, I want to point out a few notable features of this passage. For one, it has a number of curious linguistic features. It's an acrostic, for one. Verse 10 starts with Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and each successive line begins with the next letter of the alphabet. We see acrostics in a number of places in the Hebrew Bible, but it's not clear why Proverbs 31 is written this way. Someone suggested it may have been to help in the process of memorization, but I think it's meant to indicate totality. It's the A to Z of wisdom, if you will. This chapter also has very interesting parallels with Psalm 111, which is a hymn dedicated to God. Actually, all hymns are dedicated to God. So the parallels here are somewhat unexpected, especially if this is just a discussion of a good wife. Michael Fox suggests the connections with Psalm 111 are not as strong as other scholars think, and he suggests this poem should be understood as an encomium, a type of literature that extols the virtues of the subject. But this classification of Proverbs 31 and its parallels with Psalm 111 may not be mutually exclusive. We also see this poem has a lot of vocabulary markers linking it with heroic literature. The Proverbs 31 woman is called a woman of strength or woman of valor, a word elsewhere used to describe mighty warriors. She is said to lack nothing of value, a word elsewhere that means plunder, as in what is taken in victory after a battle or siege. The word used for strength in verse 17 is used elsewhere to describe powerful deeds. In verse 29, the phrase surpass them all is again elsewhere used to signify military victory. There's even more language connecting this woman with military might, but to suffice it to say, the author is deliberately using martial and heroic language to describe the woman in Proverbs 31. Finally, I think it's important to note that this chapter is the last chapter of Proverbs, and that's not coincidental. Why not end the book with the sayings of Augur or the words of Lemuel's mother. This was selected as the capstone, the final poem that ties the whole book together. As the final element of the book, we may see it as a part of a bracket that pairs with the themes at the beginning of the book. And we should understand this poem in light of those connections. So, in light of this, what can we say about the Proverbs 31 woman? Well, interpreters are split. Some interpretations actually think this section is not even talking about a woman. Instead, it may actually be a metaphor for a wise man. It could also be the Torah as the wisdom of God. But Christian scholarship generally agrees the metaphor should be understood as a woman, but what kind of woman? How do we understand this woman, given that this text was originally intended to teach men? Interpreters have looked at this passage in a number of ways, and I want to cover two of those different interpretive traditions. One is Michael Fox's idea. He suggests that the woman of strength is something of a role model. We have lots of role models throughout Proverbs. Even the ant is praised a number of times for its virtues. Fox suggests that this woman is a literary type or ideal. He says, the woman of strength is an ideal, and ideals do what mortals cannot. Second, the scope of her activities is not incredible. What she does is difficult and rare, but not entirely impossible. Her example is something to strive toward. She typifies the personification of wisdom. Fox suggests that just as Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly are counterparts, the woman of strength is the foil of the promiscuous woman mentioned earlier in Proverbs. Fox states both type figures are humans, and their humanness should not be blurred by turning them into allegories of something supposedly more important.
But not all interpreters see it that way. In fact, many do see the woman of strength as something more important. She is Lady Wisdom herself, or at least some version of her. Fox even admits there are multiple parallels between the woman of strength in Proverbs 31 and Lady Wisdom from earlier in the book. Putting a poem and even a hymn dedicated to holy wisdom personified would bracket the book quite nicely. The book begins with multiple lectures on wisdom and Lady Wisdom, so it would be fitting to end with one as well. Alan Ross says succinctly, in general, it appears that the woman in Proverbs 31 is a symbol of wisdom, even if she is not Lady Wisdom directly. Seeing the Proverbs 31 woman as an embodiment of God's wisdom also helps to make sense of the parallels with Psalm 111, a hymn dedicated to God. Now, pulling things together a bit, what exactly do we have in Proverbs 31? Well, first it seems that the text is decidedly directed to a male audience. Now, that may be surprising given how the text today is often used to instruct and encourage women, but it shouldn't be surprising given what we know about the function of sapiential literature. The heroic and martial language seems, on the one hand, more targeted to a young male audience and their interests, but on the other, it's significant as it transfers the heroic exploits of battle to the domestic realm. The parallels with Psalm 111 seem to suggest that this is no mere woman who's being discussed. Hymns are devoted to God alone, and to allude to such a hymn would not be appropriate for a purely human subject. So, we may be safe in concluding, even if the Proverbs 31 woman is meant to be an idealized type of woman who fully instantiates wisdom, she is no mere woman. She's something more. When we consider how this passage closes out the book, which begins with numerous allusions to the personification of wisdom and her foil, we should expect this passage to mirror those personifications in some manner. We hope this exploration of Proverbs 31 has helped you to see that there are a couple of tensions in how we understand this passage. One tension is between whether to understand the woman described in these verses as an ideal for women to aspire to, or as an embodiment of God's wisdom itself. Now, while these two understandings aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, this second understanding seems more likely to us for one big reason. This text was originally written for the instruction of men, not women. Now, while you could argue that this chapter is meant to instruct men in the qualities to look for in an ideal wife, that also doesn't seem to fit with an era when most marriages were arranged rather than chosen, especially for the young men of the royal courts who would be instructed by this text. We think it's best to see this chapter as fitting with the other female personifications found throughout the book of Proverbs. It seems to us that Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly are abstractions who stand for opposite things, just as the Proverbs 31 woman and the Promiscuous Woman earlier in the book are concretizations of those abstractions. That brings us to the other tension in reading Proverbs 31. This passage is so famously linked with women and used by women's Bible studies and so on, but it actually was not intended for women originally. It seems that this passage is abused a lot. Men hold women to this standard, or women hold themselves or other women to it, and that doesn't seem to fit with how we should understand this figure. If the Proverbs 31 woman is human, she is an ideal, not a set of strict standards. Women shouldn't be held to that standard any more than men should be held to the standard of adhering to all the wisdom teachings in the rest of the book. If the Proverbs 31 woman is the embodiment of wisdom itself, then the standard she sets is that much more impossible to attain by our own effort. Focusing on just one chapter misses the point of the book of Proverbs. All of the wisdom teachings apply for all of us. The woman of strength excels at what the original male audience prized, so she sets the standard for them, not for their wives. Michael Fox notes, for them, she is not just an ideal woman, she is an ideal person. By reminding us that the most important features of the wise man characterize the woman too, the whole book of Proverbs, despite its male orientation, is made to apply to women as well. This woman who embodies wisdom now illuminates the nature of God's wisdom for all of us. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you want to learn more about this topic, be sure to check out our references and resources in the description below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to subscribe and check out our video on Proverbs 8 and Lady Wisdom. Finally, if you want to support the work that we're doing, you can become one of our Beneath the Bible excavators through channel membership at the Join button below. For $5 a month, you'll get early access to each video we publish, and you'll get to be part of a monthly video call with us. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.